Hey there guys, Portal Master here, and welcome back to another episode of A Brief History of Skylanders. Today is the 6th episode in the series, and we will be talking about the final Skylanders game. This is not the final Brief History of Skylanders video. There will be another one after this, and it will be about Skylanders 7/Year 2, but not talking about like the rumors that we're hearing now. We'll be talking about the canceled Skylanders 7 game, but we'll get more into that next week, so stay tuned for that. Let's talk about Skylanders Imaginators. Skylanders Imaginators, as you are probably well aware, is the final Skylanders game to be released as of right now. It was released in October of 2016 and was developed solely by Toys for Bob, making this their second standalone game after developing Trap Team. Again, of course, there was at least consultation going back and forth between between Vicarious Visions and Toys for Bob, but by and large, development was done almost exclusively by Toys for Bob. You can tell this because of two main reasons. One, the art style. I shouldn't even have to explain to you that Swap Force and Superchargers look very different than Trap Team and Imaginators do. While Imaginators does not look like Trap Team, it definitely does not look like Superchargers either. It's an improvement, and according to a commenter from a previous episode, Vicarious Visions actually did help them out a little bit with the modeling to help get the models to look a little bit better. Skylanders Imaginators introduced two new things to the Skylanders franchise. First, it introduced the Senseis, which I have lined up all behind me. The Senseis were the gimmick character for this year. They were essentially the teachers for the Imaginators, and the Imaginators, of course, were the characters that you could create using the little creation crystals, which we'll get more into in a moment. This was, again, a game that eliminated the need for cores, so there were no cores at all. But this is also the first sequel game to feature absolutely no reposes. While Superchargers still at least somewhat used reposes in like the form of redoing them as Superchargers, there were no comeback characters in Imaginators. However, there were villains from Trap Team that were turned into Sensei characters, which I personally thought was a really cool thing, and probably one of the coolest things they did with character design in Imaginators. Diving into the actual gameplay of Skylanders Imaginators, the idea is that you would play through the game and complete the bonus levels in order to collect new parts for your Imaginators so that you could create and upgrade them. Some people, including myself, felt like the Imaginator system almost overshadowed the actual Skylanders that were introduced. And personally, I think that it was a poor business decision to do Imaginators the way that they were done. Essentially, I think that it de-incentivized buying the actual Senseis, and when the Senseis were $15 and creating your own Skylander was only 10, I sort of think that that led to a couple of issues. There were also some issues though as far as creating your own Imaginators were concerned. While I do believe that Imaginators were handled very poorly, and I think that the balance between the Imaginators and the Senseis could have probably been better, ultimately I think that one of the things that really harmed this game was the fact that you could not reset creation crystals, meaning that you were locked into your character creation once you created it. While you could change around a few things about the character, you were locked into what their class actually was. Now, a lot of people like to say, well, Portal Master, it doesn't matter that there was no way to reset the creation crystals because you could use a glitch to reset them. To which I respond, okay, that's fine for people like me, but for kids that actually played this game, for who this game was targeted at, 7-year-olds, they don't know how to do that. They're stuck with the characters they created if they want to reset them. So I've never seen that as a very valid argument. Plus, the point being is that if Activision knew how to stop that from happening, they would have. Their goal was to make it where these characters were completely unresettable, and I personally think that that was a flaw with the system that they used in Imaginators. We're going to dive into the figures before we dive into the gameplay. Skylanders Imaginators introduced 31 brand new Senseis. Essentially, for all of the original 8 elements, there were 2 new Skylanders as well as 1 new villain from Trap Team. And then for Light and Dark, there was 1 new character and 1 villain from, again, Trap Team. There was also, of course, Chaos introduced in there, so that brought us up to a grand total of 31 different Senseis, as well as Crash and Neo Cortex, which filled it in, and they were guest stars. Unlike the Nintendo guest stars from Skylanders Superchargers, both Crash and Cortex were usable on all platforms of the game, not just PlayStation. As far as creation crystals are concerned, there were 30 creation crystals that were supposed to have been released. Again, none of this is including the variants. Of these 30 creation crystals, though, several of them were not widely released or released at all. 5 of the creation crystals were never released, and 1 of the creation crystals was released in extremely limited quantities. The only place that I believe it's called the Magic Claw creation crystal was ever released was an 8-pack that was released at the very beginning of the release cycle, and it was not stated that that creation crystal would be exclusive to that pack. So as a result, people ended up not being able to get that figure. So essentially, there are 5 completely unavailable creation crystals and a 6th one that's just really difficult to get, although still not anywhere near the rarity of the yawn traps, because at least this pack was available worldwide. Alright, so I'm going to get my phone out so that I can actually read to you guys the numbers of how much it costs to get everything in Imaginators. Now, do keep in mind, this is not really going to be including creation crystals for the first part of this, because creation crystals were really not a thing you needed to do to actually unlock everything in Imaginators. You could essentially buy whatever number of them you felt like, which in my opinion was an improvement to Trap Team, but we'll get into that in a moment. So, let's talk about this. To unlock everything in Imaginators, you needed the $75 starter pack plus $120 for all 8 classes / elements, and then $15 for Chaos, which was technically his own element / battle class. If you got all of these, you were able to unlock all of the special abilities for the Imaginators, and as well unlock all of the special content that was throughout the levels. You could use all the sensei gongs, etc., etc. Basically, it cost you $210 to get everything. This is actually a pretty good price point. That was a lot lower than things like Swap Force, things like, Trap Team even, because you really didn't need nearly as much stuff. Although, to unlock all of the levels, which this is actually the game with more adventure packs than any other game. There were 5 adventure packs. There was the 2 that were announced at launch, which were the Griffin Park Observatory and the Enchanted Elven Forest. Then the one that was sort of for Crash, which was the Thumpin' Wumpa Islands. I don't think you can see that one in the camera. And then also, Lost Imaginite Mines and Cursed Tiki Temple were released after the fact. So you did actually need 5 adventure packs in order to get everything. So that brought you up to $295. If you wanted to get everything except the creation crystals, that still actually only cost you $490, and even with all the creation crystals, that was still $690, which is not a bad price point, and actually is much more similar to how Trap Team should have been done, in my opinion, in terms of pricing. While the system for creation crystals and traps was kind of similar in a way, it was also not similar at all. So essentially, you had the different molds of the traps, the different molds of the creation crystals, but ultimately they all did the same, which is how the traps and the creation crystals worked. So they were very similar in that regard. However, I think Trap Team incentivized you to have a lot more traps than Imaginators did. I mean, literally giving you the trap tray out of the box just made you feel compelled to buy like as many traps as you could, especially considering that you couldn't switch your villains on the fly, and essentially you needed to buy traps in order to capture all the villains, which was the entire point of the game. Imaginators at least said, buy as many as you want to create as many characters as you want, which is just so much better of a business model, in my personal opinion, than the way the traps were handled. Creation crystals were worth $10. Traps were not worth 7. They were probably worth closer to 5, if we're being honest. Additionally, what they did with the expansion packs towards the end of Imaginators with the Lost Imaginite Mines and the Cursed Tiki Temple is, I think, how a lot of figure releases should have been handled. I was personally a huge fan of adventure packs, and I really wished that Skylanders unlocked their own levels like they did in the original 2 games with heroic challenges. Personally, I think that this is the business model that should have been used for a lot more characters, and I think that if they'd packaged these giant bundles of characters and released them at the holiday season, they would have sold out so well, and I think that this is the model that should have been used. We'll get again a little more into why I think they did this in a moment. Skylanders Imaginators was without a doubt the laziest Skylanders game that was ever created. I don't even know that people can dispute that. I like Imaginators, and I actually think that creating your own characters was one of the cooler gimmicks. But that doesn't change the fact that I think Imaginators was one of the laziest products that was ever put out by either Toys for Bob or Vicarious Visions, and it is a stain on their reputation. I will go so far as to say that in this video. Here's why. It is the shortest game, story-wise. It has very, very few levels, and those levels aren't long. Superchargers had few levels too, but they were long. There were really long levels. Imaginators was shorter than that. They were longer than Trap Team levels, actually, which Trap Team had the shortest levels of, I think, the entire franchise. Probably for Imaginators, they were longer than Spyro's Adventure, but again, still not on par with either of the Vicarious Visions games, and there were so few levels. Honestly, it's a complete and utter disappointment. As for post-game content, there is some post-game content. I actually really like what Imaginators did with the overworld map. I think the overworld map aspect was really cool, and the fact that you could have the random encounters and that was a way to like farm loot was really, really cool. But that being said, the post-game content basically consisted of 6 side missions you could go on, and then like there was a rumble thingy, and that was basically it. There was no real good post-game content. Again, I still say that Swap Force is the example to beat in terms of post-game content, and it's what every single game should have strived to have been. And yet, there was nothing like that in Imaginators. There's 2 other things I can point to as well about how lazy this game was. For one, it's the only Skylanders game other than Giants to not introduce a brand new portal. And honestly, Giants was rushed. Like, very, very rushed. So it's almost understandable that it didn't have a new portal. And even still, it technically did have a slightly new portal because the ring around the bottom was a different color. And a lot of the portals were at least slightly redesigned. And several of them, you know, the wireless ones became wired because people realized that was a better system. So even though the design didn't change, you know, cosmetically, the functionality did change at least significantly to change them all to wired. Well, Imaginators didn't do that. For Imaginators, they actually took the Swap Force portal and stuck that in American editions, and then for Europe, Australia, and I assume pretty much the rest of the world, they created a Superchargers portal that did not have a trap slot in it. Although apparently if you pried up the part where the trap slot was on the original Superchargers portal, there actually was a trap port under there. That was something I didn't know until just the other day when one of my patrons actually told me that that was the case. On top of the laziness that was that, the fact that basically they did not create an original soundtrack for Imaginators is another just huge issue I have with the game. You can get copyright claimed just for playing the game because of the soundtracks. The soundtracks do not belong to Activision. They belong to third parties. For every other Skylanders games, 1 through 5, they paid, for the first one they paid Hans Zimmer. Hans Zimmer, mind you, did the soundtrack for Pirates of the Caribbean and for Interstellar, 2 of like really good soundtracks. And he then had one of his like apprentices essentially, which would be Lorne Balfe, do Giants through Superchargers. And then they didn't hire anybody to do an OST for Imaginators. So we're left with essentially crappy royalty-free music or music that you can pay like a licensing fee to use. That's what they did for Imaginators, and it shows the utter laziness that kind of bled throughout the entirety of this game. Let's talk about sales. Skylanders Imaginators had virtually no marketing, especially when you compare it to like the original games. Like the first 3 games had guerrilla marketing campaigns. Imaginators barely saw any marketing at all. Honestly, most of the marketing that was done for Imaginators was paying a bunch of YouTubers essentially to show off the game. That's basically all they did in the way of marketing for Imaginators, and it's really kind of sad. So let's talk again about sales. Skylanders Imaginators sold 1.95 million, the lowest selling Skylanders game in history. Let's run through the numbers again. Spyro's Adventure sold over 5 million, so did Giants. Swap Force sold over 6 million. Trap Team sold 4.5. Superchargers sold almost 3 million. Imaginators couldn't even break 2. 1.95 million sales. So, this is a decline of 900,000 copies from Superchargers, which once again, you look at this and you're like, well, Superchargers lost 1.77 million sales from Trap Team, essentially sold that much fewer. Well, let's say Imaginators sold 900,000 less than Superchargers did. That's still really bad because that's a 32% decline in sales, effectively, which is the same percentage, more or less, than the 38% decline that Superchargers saw. So despite losing, you know, only about half of the actual number of sales, it still lost about 1/3 of the total player base year over year. At this point, the decline was so strong that Imaginators sold less than 1/3 of what Swap Force sold. Swap Force sold over 6 million. Imaginators couldn't even break 2. In my personal opinion, if Imaginators had sold as well as Superchargers had even, which was still a respectable 2.85 million, a smashing success for almost any video game, even even for video games, would consider Imaginators levels of sales to be a really, really good point. Like, 2 million sales is nothing to shake a stick at. But it ultimately wasn't enough for a Toys to Life game. See, a Toys to Life game needs to have such a large install base because it needs to sell the figures. And ultimately what Imaginators could not do with a mere 2 million users was sell enough figures to make the Toys to Life worth it. I again believe that if they had sold Superchargers levels of sales, they could have clung on for a 7th game. Whether that 7th game could have pulled them out of the gutter or if it would have just driven them further down, I don't really know. But ultimately, I think the main reason for this is the lack of marketing that was put into Imaginators. Ultimately, while Imaginators was released on the Nintendo Switch, and that did pick up at least a few more sales, and is actually now one of the rarest Switch games of all time, ultimately not being released on the Wii or the 3DS, even in, any capacity, really just kind of broke the game down almost completely, in my opinion, in terms of sales. The reason that I really think this is because, well, Disney Infinity 3.0 came out in 2015. So at this point, Disney Infinity was done siphoning off sales. They were pretty much anyone who was buying into Disney Infinity instead of Skylanders had already done so. LEGO Dimensions also came out in 2015, around the time of Superchargers. So while Dimensions was still doing some sell-through at this point, LEGO Dimensions actually is interesting because it didn't sell a ton at launch. It ramped up as it went, and it sold really well, in the months following its release. So Dimensions was able to siphon off a little bit from Imaginators, but it's not like Dimensions ran for much longer. They were already slowing down by the time Imaginators came to a screeching halt. Talking a little bit more about the end of the Imaginators era, let's talk about the last Skylander that was ever released, which would be the Lost Imaginite Mines for Robo and his creation crystal. The Cursed Tiki Temple and the Lost Imaginite Mines were not planned at launch for Imaginators. We know this because there were Walmart listings or Target listings, I don't remember which one, for single packs for both of Wildstorm and Robo. And because of the fact that neither of those came to fruition and we only got the adventure packs, we do know for almost fact that those were not originally planned. Add to the fact that the Lost Imaginite Mines and Cursed Tiki Temple are the only post-game update that was ever done for Activision to actually add levels. Like, they did not do that with the Light and the Dark expansion packs, which they actually tried to keep a secret. So with that in mind, this post-game launch for these two adventure packs was not planned at the start to try to aid sales on the Switch, because the Switch edition did not come out until January, at which point almost every Skylander had been released for Imaginators. The second reason, though, I can think of is that Toys for Bob saw the writing on the wall. They wanted their chance to get a little bit of content that was not quite polished for, the game. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that it was something they had planned for a 7th game that they decided to repurpose. Additionally, it could just be that Imaginators was so rushed that the Cursed Tiki Temple and Lost Imaginite Mines were originally planned at launch, and they decided to just ship them in later on, which is actually looking like it is more and more likely, considering that some people have found remnants of the Cursed Tiki Temple in the actual original game code before it's even updated. So we really don't know why they ultimately decided to add them on there, but we do know that they did happen, and I actually think it was really cool, and I wish they'd done more. So this video has been really long. This is a really long brief history of Skylanders video, but there's so much to talk about with Imaginators because it's such an interesting title. It was so lazy done at the end of the lifespan of Skylanders, and it's interesting because it's not to blame for the death of the Skylanders franchise. It just happens to be the last one. In my opinion, if this had been swapped with Trap Team, I actually think that it would have been better for the franchise overall. I think that this could have been better. Imaginators is such a weird game because it was released at such an interesting time in the franchise's history. That's basically it. That's all I have for you guys in the main group of the brief history of Skylanders. But like I said, I'm not done, because I want to talk about what I think could have come after Imaginators had it not been canceled. We basically have it confirmed that Skylanders 7/Imaginators Year 2 were two ideas that were pitched to Activision that they decided to not pursue, to the point that we've even seen prototypes from an unfinished game. So next week, join me, because that's what we're going to be talking about in this series. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Portal Master. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, go drop me a follow on both Twitter and Instagram, and go join the Discord if you're feeling social. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks again for watching. I just wanted to take some time to thank my generous patrons on Patreon, including APYT Skylanders, Haley, Cinderclash, Adrian, OctoBoom, and the True Blue Dogemon.